Chapter 23 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 23. The Flight from Xuja. As Metak bore Bertha Kircher towards the edge of the pool, the girl at first had no conception of the deed he contemplated, but when as they approached the edge he did not lessen his speed, she guessed the frightful truth. As he leaped head foremost with her into the water, she closed her eyes and breathed a silent prayer, for she was confident that the maniac had no other purpose than to drown himself and her. And yet, so potent is the first law of nature that even in the face of certain death, as she surely believed herself, she clung tenaciously to life, and while she struggled to free herself from the powerful clutches of the madman, she held her breath against the final moment when the asphyxiating waters must inevitably flood her lungs. Through the frightful ordeal she maintained absolute control of her senses, so that after the first plunge she was aware that the man was swimming with her beneath the surface. He took perhaps not more than a dozen strokes directly toward the end wall of the pool, and then he arose, and once again she knew that her head was above the surface. She opened her eyes to see that they were in a corridor, dimly lighted by gratings set in a roof, a winding corridor, water-filled from wall to wall. Along this the man was swimming with easy, powerful strokes, at the same time holding her chin above the water. For 10 minutes he swam thus without stopping, and the girl heard him speak to her, though she could not understand what he said, as he evidently immediately realized, for, half floating, he shifted his hold upon her so that he could touch her nose and mouth with the fingers of one hand. She grasped what he meant and immediately took a deep breath, whereat he dove quickly beneath the surface, pulling her down with him, and again for a dozen strokes or more he swam thus wholly submerged. When they again came to the surface, Bertha Kircher saw that they were in a large lagoon, and that the bright stars were shining high above them, while on the other hand domed and minareted buildings were silhouetted sharply against the starlit sky. Metak swam swiftly to the north side of the lagoon, where by means of a ladder the two climbed out upon the embankment. There were others in the plaza, but they paid but little if any attention to the two bedraggled figures. As Metak walked quickly across the pavement with the girl at his side, Bertha Kircher could only guess at the man's intentions. She could see no way in which to escape, and so went docilely with him, hoping against hope that some fortuitous circumstance might eventually arise that would give her the coveted chance for freedom and life. Metak led her towards a building which, as she entered, she recognized as the same to which she and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick had been led when they were brought into the city. There was no man sitting behind the carved desk now, but about the room were a dozen or more warriors in the tunics of the house to which they were attached, in this case white, with a small lion in the form of a crest or badge upon the breast and back of each. As Metak entered and the men recognized him, they arose, and in answer to a query he put, they pointed to an arched doorway at the rear of the room. Towards this Metak led the girl, and then, as though filled with a sudden suspicion, his eyes narrowed cunningly, and turning towards the soldiery he issued an order which resulted in their all preceding him through the small doorway and up a flight of stairs a short distance beyond. The stairway and the corridor above were lighted by small flares which revealed several doors in the walls of the upper passageway. To one of these the men led the prince. Bertha Kircher saw them knock upon the door and heard a voice reply faintly through the thick door to the summons. The effect upon those about her was electrical. Instantly excitement reigned, and in response to orders from the king's son the soldiers commenced to beat heavily upon the door, to throw their bodies against it, and to attempt to hew away its panels with their sabers. The girl wondered at the cause of the evident excitement of her captors. She saw the door giving to each renewed assault, but what she did not see just before it crashed inward was the figures of two men who alone in all the world might have saved her, pass between the heavy hangings in an adjoining alcove and disappear into the dark corridor. As the door gave and the warriors rushed into the apartment followed by the prince, the latter became immediately filled with baffled rage. for the rooms were deserted except for the dead body of the owner of the palace and the still form of the black slave, Otobu, where they lay stretched upon the floor of the alcove. The prince rushed to the windows and looked out, but as the suite overlooked the barred den of lions from which, the prince thought, there could be no escape, his puzzlement was only increased. Though he searched about the room for some clue to the whereabouts of its former occupants, he did not discover the niche behind the hangings. With the fickleness of insanity, he quickly tired of the search, and, turning to the soldiers who had accompanied him from the floor below, dismissed them. After setting up the broken door as best they could, the men left the apartment, and when they were again alone, Metak turned towards the girl. As he approached her, his face distorted by a hideous leer. His features worked rapidly in spasmodic twitches. The girl, who was standing at the entrance of the alcove, shrank back, her horror reflected in her face. Step by step she backed across the room, while the crouching maniac crept stealthily after her, with claw-like fingers poised in anticipation of the moment they should leap forth and seize her. As she passed the body of the Negro, her foot touched some obstacle at her side. At glancing down, she saw the spear at which Otobu had been supposed to hold the prisoners. Instantly she leaned forward and snatched it from the floor with its sharp point directed at the body of the madman. The effect upon Metak was electrical. From stealthy silence he broke into harsh peals of laughter, and drawing his saber danced to and fro before the girl, but whichever way he went the point of the spear still threatened him. Gradually the girl noticed a change in the tone of the creature's screams that was also reflected in the changing expression upon his hideous countenance. His hysterical laughter was slowly changing to cries of rage, while the silly leer upon his face was supplanted by a ferocious scowl and upcurled lips, which revealed the sharpened fangs beneath. He now ran rapidly and almost to the spear point, only to jump away, run a few steps to one side, and again attempt to make an entrance, the while he slashed and hewed at the spear with such violence that it was with difficulty the girl maintained her guard, and all the time was forced to give ground step by step. She had reached the point where she was standing squarely against the couch at the side of the room when, with an incredibly swift movement, Metak stooped and grasping a low stool hurled it directly at her head. She raised the spear to fend off the heavy missile, but she was not entirely successful, and the impact of the blow carried her backward upon the couch, and instantly Metak was upon her. Tarzan and Smith Oldwick gave little thought as to what had become of the other two occupants of the room. They were gone, and so far as these two were concerned, they might never return. Tarzan's one desire was to reach the street again, where, now that both of them were in some sort of disguise, they should be able to proceed with comparative safety to the palace and continue their search for the girl. Smith Oldwick preceded Tarzan along the corridor, and as they reached the ladder he climbed aloft to remove the trap. He worked for a moment, and then turning, addressed Tarzan. "Did we replace the cover on this trap when we came down? I don't recall that we did." "No," said Tarzan, "it was left open." "So I thought," said Smith Oldwick, "but it's closed now and locked. I can't move it. Possibly you can," and he descended the ladder. Even Tarzan's immense strength, however, had no effect other than to break one of the rungs of the ladder against which he was pushing, nearly precipitating him to the floor below. After the rung broke he rested for a moment before renewing his efforts, and as he stood with his head near the cover of the trap he distinctly heard voices on the roof above him. Dropping down to Oldwick's side he told him what he had heard. "We had better find some other way out," he said, and the two started to retrace their steps toward the alcove. Tarzan was again in the lead, and as he opened the door in the back of the niche he was suddenly startled to hear, in tones of terror and in a woman's voice, the words, "Oh God, be merciful," from just beyond the hangings. Here was no time for cautious investigation, and not even waiting to find the aperture and part of the hangings, but with one sweep of his brawny hand dragging them from their support, the ape-man leaped from the niche into the alcove. At the sound of his entry the maniac looked up, and as he saw at first only a man in the uniform of his father's soldiers, he shrieked forth an angry order, but at the second glance, which revealed the face of the newcomer, the madman leapt from the prostrate form of the victim and, apparently forgetful of his saber which he had dropped upon the floor beside the couch as he leapt to grapple the girl, closed with bare hands upon his antagonist, his sharp-filed teeth searching for the other's throat. Metak, the son of Heorot, was no weakling. Powerful by nature and rendered still more so in the throes of one of his maniacal fits of fury, he was no mean antagonist, even for the mighty ape-man, and to this a distinct advantage for him was added by the fact that almost at the outset of their battle Tarzan, in stepping backwards, struck his heel against the corpse of the man whom Smith Oldwick had killed, and fell heavily backward to the floor with Metak upon his breast. With the quickness of a cat the maniac made an attempt to fasten his teeth in Tarzan's jugular, but a quick movement of the latter resulted in his finding a hold only upon the Tarmangani's shoulder. Here he clung while his fingers sought Tarzan's throat, and it was then that the ape-man, realizing the possibility of defeat, called to Smith Oldwick to take the girl and to seek escape. The Englishman looked questioningly at Bertha Kircher, who now had risen from the couch, shaking and trembling. She saw the question in his eyes, and with an effort she drew herself to her full height. "No," she cried. "If he dies here, I shall die with him. Go if you wish to. You can do nothing here, but I cannot go." Tarzan had now regained his feet, but the maniac still clung to him tenaciously. The girl turned suddenly to Smith Oldwick. "Your pistol!" she cried. "Why don't you shoot him?" The man drew the weapon from his pocket and approached the two antagonists. But by this time they were moving so rapidly that there was no opportunity for shooting one without the danger of hitting the other. At the same time Bertha Kircher circled about them with the prince's saber, but neither could she find an opening. Again and again the two men fell to the floor, until presently Tarzan found a hold upon the other's throat, against which contingency Metak had been constantly battling, and slowly, as the giant fingers closed, the other's mad eyes protruded from his livid face, his jaws gaped and released their hold upon Tarzan's shoulder, and then, in a sudden excess of disgust and rage, the ape-man lifted the body of the prince high above his head, and with all the strength of his great arms hurled it across the room and through the window, where it fell with a sickening thud into the pit of lions beneath. As Tarzan turned again towards his companions, the girl was standing with the saber still in her hand and an expression upon her face that he never had seen there before. Her eyes were wide and misty with unshed tears, while her sensitive lips trembled as though she were upon the point of giving way to some pent emotion which her rapidly rising and falling bosom plainly indicated she was fighting to control. "If we're going to get out of here," said the ape-man, "we can't lose any time. We are together at last and nothing can be gained by delay. The question now is the safest way. The couple who escaped us evidently departed through the passageway to the roof and secured the trap against us so that we are cut off in that direction. What chance have we below? You came that way," and he turned toward the girl. "At the foot of the stairs," she said, "is a room full of armed men. I doubt if we could pass that way." It was then that Otobu raised himself to a sitting posture. "So you are not dead after all," exclaimed the ape-man. "Come, how bad are you hurt?" The Negro rose gingerly to his feet, moved his arms and legs, and felt of his head. "Otobu does not seem to be hurt at all, Bwana," he replied, "only for a great ache in his head." "Good," said the ape-man. "You want to return to Wamabo country?" "Yes, Bwana." "Then lead us from the city by the safest way." "There is no safe way," replied the black, "and even if we reach the gates we shall have to fight. I can lead you from this building to a side street with little danger of meeting anyone on the way. Beyond that we must take our chance of discovery. You are all dressed as are the people of this wicked city, so perhaps we may pass unnoticed, but at the gate it will be a different matter, for none is permitted to leave the city at night." "Very well," replied the ape-man. "Let us be on our way." Otobu led them through the broken door of the outer room, and partway down the corridor he turned to another apartment at the right. As they crossed to the passageway beyond, and finally, traversing several rooms and corridors, he led them down a flight of steps to a door which opened directly upon the side street in rear of the palace. Two men, a woman, and a black slave were not so extraordinary a sight upon the streets of the city as to arouse comment. When passing beneath the flares, the three Europeans were careful to choose a moment when no chance pedestrian might happen to get a view of their features, but in the shadow of the arcades there seemed little danger of detection. They had covered a good portion of the distance to the gate without mishap when there came to their ears from the central portion of the city sounds of a great commotion. "What does that mean?" Tarzan asked Otobu, who was now trembling violently. "Master," he replied, "they have discovered what has happened in the palace of Veza, mayor of the city. His son and the girl escaped and summoned soldiers who have now doubtless discovered the body of Veza." "I wonder," said Tarzan, "if they have discovered the party I threw through the window." Bertha Kircher, who understood enough of the dialect to follow their conversation, asked Tarzan if he knew that the man he had thrown from the window was the king's son. The ape man laughed. "No," he said, "I did not. That rather complicates matters, at least if they have found him." Suddenly there broke above the turmoil behind them a clear strains of a bugle. Otobu increased his pace. "Hurry, master," he cried. "It is worse than I had thought." "What do you mean?" asked Tarzan. "For some reason the king's guard and the king's lions are being called out. I fear, O Bwana, that we cannot escape them. But why should they be called out for us I do not know." But if Otobu did not know, Tarzan at least guessed that they had found the body of the king's son. Once again the notes of the bugle rose high and clear upon the night air. "Calling more lions?" asked Tarzan. "No, master," replied Otobu. "It is the parrots they are calling." They moved on rapidly in silence for a few minutes when their attention was attracted by the flapping of the wings of a bird above them. They looked up to discover a parrot circling about over their heads. "Here are the parrots, Otobu," said Tarzan with a grin. "Do they expect to kill us with parrots?" The Negro moaned as the bird darted suddenly ahead of them toward the city wall. "Now indeed we are lost, master," cried the black. "The bird that found us has flown to the gate to warn the guard." "Come, Otobu, what are you talking about?" exclaimed Tarzan irritably. "Have you lived among these lunatics so long that you are yourself mad?" "No, master," replied Otobu, "I am not mad. You do not know them. These terrible birds are like human beings without hearts or souls. They speak the language of the people of the city of Xuja. They are demons, master, and when in sufficient numbers they might even attack and kill us." "How far are we from the gate?" asked Tarzan. "We are not very far," replied the Negro. "Beyond this next turn we will see it a few paces ahead of us. But the bird has reached it before us and by now they are summoning the guard." The truth of which statement was almost immediately indicated by the sounds of many voices raised evidently in commands just ahead of them, while from behind came increased evidence of approaching pursuit, loud screams and the roars of lions. A few steps ahead a narrow alley opened from the east into the thoroughfare they were following, and as they approached it there emerged from its dark shadows the figure of a mighty lion. Otobu halted in his tracks and shrank back against Tarzan. "Look, master," he whimpered, "a great black lion of the forest." Tarzan drew the saber which still hung at his side. "We cannot go back," he said. "Lions, parrots, or men, it must all be the same," and he moved steadily forward in the direction of the gate. What wind was stirring in the city street moved from Tarzan towards the lion, and when the ape-man had approached to within a few yards of the beast who had stood silently eyeing them up to this time, instead of the expected roar, a whine broke from the beast's throat. The ape-man was conscious of a very decided feeling of relief. "It's Numa of the pit," he called back to his companions and to Otobu. "Do not fear, this lion will not harm us." Numa moved forward to the ape-man's side and then turning paced beside him along the narrow street. At the next turn they came in sight of the gate, where beneath several flares they saw a group of at least 20 warriors prepared to seize them, while from the opposite direction the roars of the pursuing lions sounded close upon them, mingling with the screams of numerous parrots which now circled about their heads. Tarzan halted and turned to the young aviator. "How many rounds of ammunition have you left?" he asked. "I have 7 in the pistol," replied Smith Oldwick, "and perhaps a dozen more cartridges in my blouse pocket." "I'm going to rush them," said Tarzan. "Otobo, you stay at the side of the woman. Oldwick, you and I will go ahead, you upon my left. I think we need not try to tell Numa what to do, for even then the great lion was baring his fangs and growling ferociously at the guardsmen, who appeared uneasy in the face of this creature which above all others they feared. "As we advance, Oldwick," said the ape man, "fire one shot. It may frighten them, and after that fire only when necessary. All ready? Let's go," and he moved forward toward the gate. At the same time Smith Oldwick discharged his weapon and a yellow-coated warrior screamed and crumpled forward upon his face. For a minute the others showed symptoms of panic, but one, who seemed to be an officer, rallied them. "Now," said Tarzan, "all together," and he started to run for the gate. Simultaneously the lion, evidently scenting the purpose of the Tarmangani, broke into a full charge toward the guard. Shaken by the report of the unfamiliar weapon, the ranks of the guardsmen broke before the furious assault of the great beast. The officer screamed forth a volley of commands in a mad fury of uncontrolled rage, but the guardsmen, obeying the first law of nature, as well as actuated by their inherent fear of the black denizen of the forest, scattered to the right and left to elude the monster. With ferocious growls Numa wheeled to the right and with raking talons struck right and left among the little handful of terrified guardsmen who were endeavoring to elude him, and then Tarzan and Smith Oldwick closed with the others. For a moment their most formidable antagonist was the officer in command. He wielded his curved saber as only an adept might as he faced Tarzan, to whom the similar weapon in his own hand was most unfamiliar. Smith Oldwick could not fire for fear of hitting the ape man, when suddenly to his dismay he saw Tarzan's weapon fly from his grasp as the Xujan warrior neatly disarmed his opponent. With a scream the fellow raised his saber for the final cut that would terminate the earthly career of Tarzan of the Apes when, to the astonishment of both the ape man and Smith Oldwick, the fellow stiffened rigidly, his weapon dropped from his nerveless fingers of his upraised hand, his mad eyes rolled upward and foam flecked his bared lip. Grasping as though in the throes of strangulation, the fellow pitched forward at Tarzan's feet. Tarzan stooped and picked up the dead man's weapon, a smile upon his face as he turned and glanced toward the young Englishman. "The fellow is an epileptic," said Smith Oldwick. "I suppose many of them are. Their nervous condition is not without its good points. A normal man would have gotten you." The other guardsmen seemed utterly demoralized at the loss of their leader. They were huddled upon the opposite side of the street at the left of the gate, screaming at the top of their voices and looking in the direction from which sounds of reinforcements were coming, as though urging on the men and lions that were already too close for comfort of the fugitives. 6 guardsmen still stood with their backs against the gate, their weapons flashing in the light of the flares, and their parchment-like faces distorted in horrid grimaces of rage and terror. Numa had pursued 2 fleeing warriors down the street which paralleled the wall for a short distance at this point. The ape man turned to Smith Oldwick. "You will have to use your pistol now," he said, "and we must get by these fellows at once." And as the Englishman fired, Tarzan rushed in to close quarters as though he had not already discovered that with the saber he was no match for these trained swordsmen. 2 men fell to Smith Oldwick's first 2 shots, and then he missed, while the 4 remaining divided, 2 leaping for the aviator and 2 for Tarzan. The ape man rushed in an effort to close with one of his antagonists, where the other's saber would be comparatively useless. Smith Oldwick dropped one of his assailants with a bullet through the chest and pulled his trigger on the second, only to have the hammer fall futilely upon an empty chamber. The cartridges in his weapon were exhausted, and the warrior, with his razor-edged gleaming saber, was upon him. Tarzan raised his own weapon but once, and that to divert a vicious cut for his head. Then he was upon one of his assailants, and before the fellow could regain his equilibrium and leap back after delivering his cut, the ape-man had seized him by the neck and crotch. Tarzan's other antagonist was edging around to one side where he might use his weapon, and as he raised the blade to strike at the back of the Tarmangani's neck, The latter swung the body of his comrade upward so that it received the full force of the blow. The blade sank deep into the body of the warrior, eliciting a single frightful scream, and then Tarzan hurled the dying man in the face of his final adversary. Smith Oldwick, hard pressed and now utterly defenseless, had given up all hope in the instant that he realized his weapon was empty, when from his left a living bolt of black-maned ferocity shot past him to the breast of his opponent. Down went the Xujan, his face bitten away by one snap of the powerful jaws of Numa of the pit. In the few seconds that had been required for the consummation of these rapidly ensuing events, Otobu had dragged Bertha Kircher to the gate which he had unbarred and thrown open, and with the vanquishing of the last of the active guardsmen, the party passed out of the maniac city of Xuja into the outer darkness beyond. At the same moment a half-dozen lions rounded the last turn in the road leading back towards the plaza, and at sight of them Numa the pit wheeled and charged. For a moment the lions of the city stood their ground, but only for a moment, and then before the black beast was upon them they turned and fled, while Tarzan and his party moved rapidly toward the blackness of the forest beyond the garden. "Will they follow us out of the city?" Tarzan asked Otobu. "Not at night," replied the black. "I have been a slave here for 5 years, but never have I known these people to leave the city by night. If they go beyond the forest in the daytime, they usually wait until the dawn of another day before they return, as they fear to pass through the country of the black lions after dark. No, I think, master, that they will not follow us tonight, but tomorrow they will come, and, O Bwana, then they will surely get us, or those who are left of us, for at least one among us must be the toll of the black lions as we pass through their forest." As they crossed the garden, Smith Oldwick refilled the magazine of his pistol and inserted a cartridge in the chamber. The girl moved silently at Tarzan's left, between him and the aviator. Suddenly the ape-man stopped and turned toward the city, his mighty frame clothed in the yellow tunic of Herog's soldiery, plainly visible to the others beneath the light of the stars. They saw him raise his head, and they heard break from his lips the plaintive note of a lion calling to his fellows. Smith Oldwick felt a distinct shudder pass through his frame, while Otobu, rolling the whites of his eyes in terrified surprise, sank trembling to his knees. But the girl thrilled, and she felt her heart beat in strange exultation, and then she drew nearer to the beast man until her shoulder touched his arm. The act was involuntary, and for a moment she scarce realized what she had done, and then she stepped silently back, thankful that the light of the stars was not sufficient to reveal to the eyes of her companions the flush which she felt mantling her cheek. Yet she was not ashamed of the impulse that had prompted her, but rather the act itself, which she knew, had Tarzan noticed it, would have been repulsive to him. From the open gate of the city of maniacs came the answering cry of a lion. The little group waited where they stood until presently they saw the majestic portions of the black lion as he approached them along the trail. When he had rejoined them, Tarzan fastened the fingers of one hand in the black mane and started on once more toward the forest. Behind them, from the city, rose a bedlam of horrid sounds, the roaring of lions mingling with the raucous voices of the screaming parrots and the mad shrieks of the maniacs. As they entered the Stygian darkness of the forest, the girl once again involuntarily shrank closer to the ape-man, and this time Tarzan was aware of the contact. Himself without fear, yet he instinctively appreciated how terrified the girl must be. Actuated by a sudden kindly impulse, he found her hand and took it in his own, and thus they continued upon their way, groping through the blackness of the trail. Twice they were approached by forest lions, but upon both occasions the deep growls of Numa of the pit drove off their assailants. Several times they were compelled to rest, for Smith Oldwick was constantly upon the verge of exhaustion, and towards morning Tarzan was forced to carry him on the steep ascent from the bed of the valley. End of chapter 23. Recording by Dan Mason of Midland, Michigan. Chapter 24 of Tarzan the Untamed. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Mason. Tarzan the Untamed by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 24. The Tommies. Daylight overtook them after they had entered the gorge, but, tired as they all were, with the exception of Tarzan, they realized that they must keep on at all costs until they found a spot where they might ascend the precipitous side of the gorge to the floor of the plateau above. Tarzan and Otobu were both equally confident that the Xujas would not follow them beyond the gorge, but though they scanned every inch of the frowning cliffs upon either hand, noon came and there was still no indication of any avenue of escape to right or left. There were places where the ape-man alone might have negotiated the ascent, but none where the others could hope successfully to reach the plateau, nor where Tarzan, powerful and agile as he was, could have ventured safely to carry them aloft. For half a day the ape-man had been either carrying or supporting Smith Oldwick, and now, to his chagrin, he saw that the girl was faltering. He had realized well how much she had undergone, and how greatly the hardships and dangers and the fatigue of the past weeks must have told upon her vitality. He saw how bravely she attempted to keep up, yet how often she stumbled and staggered as she labored through the sand and gravel of the gorge. Nor could he help but admire her fortitude and the uncomplaining effort she was making to push on. The Englishman must have noticed her condition too, for some time after noon he stopped suddenly and sat down in the sand. "It's no use," he said to Tarzan. "I can go no farther. Miss Kircher was rapidly weakening. You will have to go on without me." "No," said the girl, "we cannot do that. We have all been through so much together, and the chances of our escape are still so remote that whatever comes, let us remain together unless," and she looked up at Tarzan, "you, who have done so much for us to whom you are under no obligations, will go on without us. I for one wish you would. It must be as evident to you as it is to me that you cannot save us, for though you succeed in dragging us from the path of our pursuers, even your great strength and endurance could never take one of us across the desert waste which lies between here and the nearest fertile country." The ape-man returned her serious look with a smile. "You are not dead," he said to her, "nor is the lieutenant, nor Otobu, nor myself. One is either dead or alive, and until we are dead we should plan only upon continuing to live. Because we remain here and rest is no indication that we shall die here. I cannot carry you both on the country of the Wamabos, which is the nearest spot at which we may expect to find game and water, but we shall not give up on that account. So far we have found a way. Let us take things as they come. Let us rest now, because you and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick need the rest, and when you are stronger we will go on again." "But the Xujas?" she asked. "May they not follow us here?" "Yes," he said, "they probably will, but we need not be concerned with them until they come." "I wish," said the girl, "that I possessed your philosophy, but I am afraid it's beyond me." "You were not born and reared in the jungle by wild beasts and among wild beasts, or you would possess, as I do, the fatalism of the jungle." And so they moved to the side of the gorge beneath the shade of an overhanging rock and lay down in the hot sand to rest. Numa wandered restlessly to and fro and finally, after sprawling for a moment close beside the ape-man, rose and moved off up the gorge to be lost to view a moment later beyond the nearest turn. For an hour the little party rested, and then Tarzan suddenly rose and, motioning the others to silence, listened. For a minute he stood motionless, his keen ears acutely receptive to the sounds so faint and distant that none of the other three could detect the slightest break in the utter and deathlike quiet of the gorge. Finally the ape-man relaxed and turned toward them. "What is it?" asked the girl. "They are coming," he replied. "They are yet some distance away, though not far, for the sandaled feet of the men and the pads of the lions make little noise upon the soft sands." "What shall we do? Try to go on?" asked Smith Oldwick. "I believe I could make a go of it now for a short way. I am much rested. How about you, Miss Kircher?" "Oh, yes," she said. "I am much stronger. Yes, surely I can go on." Tarzan knew that neither of them quite spoke the truth, that people do not recover so quickly from utter exhaustion, but he saw no other way, and there was always the hope that just beyond the next turn would be a way out of the gorge. "You help the lieutenant, Otobu," he said, turning to the black, "and I will carry Miss Kircher," and though the girl objected, saying that he must not waste his strength, he lifted her lightly in his arms and moved off up the canyon, followed by Otobu and the Englishman. They had gone no great distance when the others of the party became aware of the sounds of pursuit, for now the lions were whining as though the fresh scent spoor of their quarry had reached their nostrils. "I wish that your Numa would return," said the girl. "Yes," said Tarzan, "but we shall have to do the best we can without him. I should like to find some place where we can barricade ourselves against attack from all sides. Possibly then we might hold them off. Smith Oldwick is a good shot, and if there are not too many men he might be able to dispose of them, provided they can only come at him one at a time. The lions don't bother me so much. Sometimes they're stupid animals, and I'm sure that these that pursue us and who are so dependent upon the masters that have raised and trained them will be easily handled after the warriors are disposed of." "You think there is some hope then?" she asked. "We are still alive," was his only answer. "There," he said presently, "I thought I recalled this very spot." He pointed towards a fragment that had evidently fallen from the summit off the cliff and which now lay embedded in the sand a few feet from the base. It was a jagged fragment of rock which rose some 10 feet above the surface of the sand, leaving a narrow aperture between it and the cliff behind. Towards this they directed their steps, and when finally they reached their goal they found a space about 2 feet wide and 10 feet long between the rock and the cliff. To be sure, it was open at both ends, but at least they could not be attacked upon all sides at once. They had scarcely concealed themselves before Tarzan's quick ears caught a sound upon the face of the cliff above them, and looking up he saw a diminutive monkey perched upon a slight projection, an ugly-faced little monkey who looked down upon them for a moment and then scampered away toward the south in the direction from which their pursuers were coming. Otobu had seen the monkey too. "He will tell the parrots," said the black, "and the parrots will tell the madmen." "It is all the same," replied Tarzan. "The lions would have found us here. We could not hope to hide from them." He placed Smith Oldwick with his pistol at the north opening of their haven and told Otobu to stand with his spear at the Englishman's shoulder, while he himself prepared to guard the southern approach. Between them he had the girl lie down in the sand. "You will be safe there in the event that they use their spears," he said. The minutes that dragged by seemed veritable eternities to Bertha Kircher, and then at last, and almost with relief, she knew that the pursuers were upon them. She heard the angry roaring of the lions and the cries of the madmen. For several minutes the men seemed to be investigating the stronghold which their quarry had discovered. She could hear them both to the north and south, and then from where she lay she saw a lion charging for the ape-man before her. She saw the giant arm swing back with the curved saber, and she saw it fall with terrific velocity and meet the lion as he rose to grapple with the man, cleaving his skull as cleanly as a butcher opens a sheep. Then she heard footsteps running rapidly toward Smith Oldwick, and, as his pistol spoke, there was a scream and the sound of a falling body. Evidently disheartened by the failure of their first attempt, the assaulters drew off, but only for a short time. Again they came, this time a man opposing Tarzan and a lion seeking to overcome Smith Oldwick. Tarzan had cautioned the young Englishman not to waste his cartridges upon the lions, and it was Otobu with the Xujan spear who met the beast, which was not subdued until both he and Smith Oldwick had been mauled, and the latter had succeeded in running the point of the saber the girl had carried into the beast's heart. The man who opposed Tarzan inadvertently came too close in an attempt to cut at the ape-man's head, with the result that an instant later his corpse lay with the neck broken upon the body of the lion. Once again the enemy withdrew, but again only for a short time, and now they came in full force, the lions and the men, possibly a half a dozen of each, the men casting their spears and the lions waiting just behind, evidently for the signal to charge. "Is this the end?" asked the girl. "No," cried the ape-man, "for we are still alive." The words had scarcely passed his lips when the remaining warriors, rushing in, cast their spears simultaneously from both sides. In attempting to shield the girl, Tarzan received one of the shafts in the shoulder, and so heavily had the weapon been hurled that it bore him backward to the ground. Smith Oldwick fired his pistol twice when he too was struck down, the weapon entering his right leg midway between hip and knee. Only Otobu remained to face the enemy, for the Englishman, already weak from his wounds and from the latest mauling he had received at the claws of the lion, had lost consciousness as he sank to the ground with his new hurt. As he fell, his pistol dropped from his fingers, and the girl, seeing, snatched it up. As Tarzan struggled to rise, one of the warriors leapt full upon his breast and bore him back as with fiendish shrieks he raised the point of his saber above the other's heart. Before he could drive it home, the girl leveled Smith Oldwick's pistol and fired point blank at the fiend's face. Simultaneously there broke upon the astonished ears of both attackers and attacked a volley of shots from the gorge. With the sweetness of the voice of an angel from heaven, the Europeans heard the sharp-barked commands of an English non-com. Even above the roars of the lions and the screams of the maniacs, those beloved tones reached the ears of Tarzan and the girl at the very moment that even the ape-man had given up the last vestige of hope. Rolling the body of the warrior to one side, Tarzan struggled to his feet, the spear still protruding from his shoulder. The girl rose too, and as Tarzan wrenched the weapon from his flesh and stepped out from behind the concealment of the refuge, she followed at his side. The skirmish that had resulted in their rescue was soon over. Most of the lions escaped, but all of the pursuing Xujas had been slain. As Tarzan and the girl came into full view of the group, the British Tommy leveled his rifle at the ape-man. Seeing the fellow's actions and realizing instantly the natural error that Tarzan's yellow tunic had occasioned, the girl sprang between him and the soldier. "Don't shoot," she cried to the latter. "We are both friends." "Hold up your hands, you, then," he commanded Tarzan. "I ain't taking no chances with any duffer with a yellow shirt." At this juncture the British sergeant who had been in command of the advance guard approached, and when Tarzan and the girl spoke to him in English, explaining their disguises, he accepted their word, since they were evidently not of the same race as the creatures which lay dead about them. 10 minutes later the main body of the expedition came into view. Smith Oldwick's wounds were dressed, as well as were those of the ape-man, and in half an hour they were on their way to the camp of their rescuers. That night it was arranged that the following day Smith Oldwick and Bertha Kircher should be transported to British headquarters near the coast by aeroplane, the 2 planes attached to the expeditionary force being requisitioned for the purpose. Tarzan and Otobu declined the offers of the British captain to accompany his force overland on the return march, as Tarzan explained that his country lay to the west, as did Otobu's, and that they would travel together as far as the country of the Wamabos. "You are not going back with us, then?" asked the girl. "No," replied the ape-man. "My home is to the west coast. I will continue my journey in that direction." She cast appealing eyes towards him. "You will go back into that terrible jungle?" she asked. "We shall never see you again?" He looked at her a moment in silence. "Never," he said, and without another word turned and walked away. In the morning Colonel Capell came from the base camp in one of the planes that was to carry Smith Oldwick and the girl to the east. Tarzan was standing some distance away as the ship landed and the officer descended to the ground. He saw the colonel greet his junior in command of the advanced detachment, and then he saw him turn toward Bertha Kircher, who was standing a few paces behind the captain. Tarzan wondered how the German spy felt in this situation, especially when she must know that there was one there who knew her real status. He saw Colonel Capell walk towards her with outstretched hands and smiling face, and although he could not hear the words of his greeting, he saw that it was friendly and cordial to a degree. Tarzan turned away scowling. and if any had been close by they might have heard a low growl rumble from his chest. He knew that his country was at war with Germany, and that not only his duty to the land of his fathers, but also his personal grievance against the enemy people and his hatred of them demanded that he expose the girl's perfidy. And yet he hesitated, and because he hesitated he growled, not at the German spy, but at himself for his weakness. He did not see her again before she entered a plane and was bore away toward the east. He bid farewell to Smith Oldwick and received again the oft-repeated thanks of the young Englishman, and then he saw him too bore aloft in the high circling plane and watched until the ship became a speck far above the eastern horizon to disappear at last high in the air. The Tommies, their packs and accoutrements slung, were awaiting the summons to continue their return march. Colonel Capell had, through the desire to personally observe the stretch of country between the camp of the advanced detachment and the base, decided to march back his troops. Now that all was in readiness for departure, he turned to Tarzan. "I wish you would come back with us, Greystoke," he said, "and if my appeal carries no inducement, possibly that of Smith Oldwick and the young lady who just left us may. They ask me to urge you to return to civilization." "No," said Tarzan, "I shall go my own way. Miss Kircher and Lieutenant Smith Oldwick were only prompted by a sense of gratitude in considering my welfare." "Miss Kircher!" exclaimed Campbell, and then he laughed. "You know her then as Bertha Kircher, the German spy?" Tarzan looked at the other a moment in silence. It was beyond him to conceive that a British officer should thus laconically speak of an enemy spy whom he had had within his power and permitted to escape. "Yes," he replied, "I knew that she was Bertha Kircher, the German spy." "Is that all you knew?" asked Capell. "That is all," said the ape-man. "She is the Honorable Patricia Campbell," said Campbell, "one of the most valuable members of the British intelligence service attached to the East African forces. Her father and I served in India together, and I have known her ever since she was born." "Why, here's a packet of papers she took from a German officer and has been carrying around through all her vicissitudes, single-minded in the performance of her duty. Look, I haven't had time to examine them, but as you see here is a military sketch map, a bundle of reports, and the diary of one Hauptmann Fritz Snyder." "The diary of Hauptmann Fritz Snyder!" repeated Tarzan in a constrained voice. "May I see it, Capell? He is the man who murdered Lady Greystoke." The Englishman handed the little volume over to the other without a word. Tarzan ran through the pages quickly, looking for a certain date, the date of the horror that had been committed, and when he found it he read rapidly. Suddenly a gasp of incredulity burst from his lips. Capell looked at him questioningly. "God!" exclaimed the ape-man. "Can this be true? Listen!" And he read an excerpt from the closely written page. "Played a little joke on the English pig. When he comes home he will find the burned body of his wife in her boudoir, but he will only think it is his wife. Had von Goss substituted the body of a dead negress and char it after putting Lady Greystoke's rings on it, Lady G will be of more value to the High Command alive than dead." "She lives!" cried Tarzan. "Thank God!" exclaimed Campbell. "And now?" "I will return with you, of course. How terribly I have wronged Miss Canby! But how could I know? I even told Smith Oldwick, who loves her, that she was a German spy. Not only must I return to find my wife, but I must right this wrong." "Don't worry about that," said Capell. "She must have convinced him that she's no enemy spy, for just before they left this morning he told me she had promised to marry him." Chapter 24.